This conversation was recorded live on stage at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, a festival co-presented by the Ethics Centre and the UNSW Centre for Ideas.
Hello, hello. How are we today? Welcome to LSD Forbidden Medicine. My name is Natasha Mitchell, and when you think of LSD, if you're a nerd like me, a bit of a chemistry nerd, you might think, oh yes, that's lysergic acid diphenhydramide. Or you might think, if you're a baby boomer, you might think of the late Timothy Leary. He will come to mind, the psychologist who was fired from Harvard for his LSD experiments on students and himself, who became a figurehead of the 1960s countercultural movement and psychedelia. So there's Timothy Leary. If you've tried LSD, what might come to mind is that time where you went tripping and everything just looked really, wow, man. Those trees, those flowers, I'm part of... Anyway, there was that. What you might not think of is today's speaker, who joins us from California. Ayelet, a former federal public defender, an adjunct professor at UC Berkeley Law School, a New York Times best-selling author, writer and novelist, a mother of four, a self-described yoga pant-wearing, etc., all the cliches, a responsible citizen. And her latest book is A Really Good Day, How Microdosing Made a Mega Difference in My Mood, My Marriage, and My Life. And we're about to find out why. Please give her a beautiful Sydney welcome from Berkeley, California to Cockatoo Island. Please welcome Ayelet.
Hello. How are you all? It is so delightful to be here. I've been really milking my time here in Sydney. I flew from Rose Bay to Palm Beach in a seaplane yesterday. I've been out on the ferries. I've been trying to see everything. This is such an astonishingly beautiful city. And it's also not the United States, where we're facing a horrible election. And I didn't realize just how stressed and miserable I was until I was, swooping in a plane over the Opera House feeling free as a bird. It's nice when you don't actually have any familiarity with the political situation of the country you're in, because you can't get yourself all worked up about it. I'm sure you have your problems. So one day, a number of years ago, and I am purposely vague about the number, I went out to my mailbox, I opened it up, and I found a package. The package was festooned with very brightly colored stamps, decades old, some of them. The return address read, Lewis Carroll. Looked at the package, I brought it inside, I opened it up, and I found a tiny cobalt blue bottle and a little poem and instructions for use. The bottle contained diluted LSD, and the instructions were to place 2 drops, 5 micrograms per drop, under my tongue once every 3 days. So, I took a deep breath. I'm not an idiot. I don't take drugs that arrive in my mailbox. I went and I ordered an LSD testing kit. Does anybody know where? Anybody can guess where I found an LSD testing kit? It's the same place that I get my toilet paper and my trade paperbacks. Amazon.com. I ordered an LSD testing kit from Amazon.com. I tested the contents of the blue bottle, and once I was satisfied that it was in fact LSD and nothing toxic, I decided to give the experiment a try. Now, the question is why? Why was I, a middle-aged mother of 4, an ostensibly responsible citizen, an attorney, doing something that is completely illegal? And let's be clear, it is absolutely illegal. And however many of you come up to me afterwards and ask me for LSD, I am not going to give it to you because it's illegal. If you ask me how to get it, I'm not going to tell you because it's illegal. Just clarifying from hard experience. So why was I doing this? Why was I embarking on this insane experiment with an illegal drug? Well, I was doing it in order to avoid killing myself. When I was pregnant with my fourth child, who is now 15 years old, I was diagnosed at the time with bipolar disorder. The diagnosis came after an experience driving across one of the bridges in Northern California where I live. I'd had a very bad day. I was driving across the bridge, and I had this incredible urge to swing my wheel hard right. Remember, we're on the opposite side of the road there, and send myself over the side of the bridge. That terrified me. I called a psychiatrist. Within 2 days, I was taking antidepressants. And over the next decade or so, I took pretty much any antidepressant you can name. I took Celexa, I took Zoloft, I took mood stabilizers like Topamax. I took Seroquel a couple of times, which is an antipsychotic. Who knows why that was prescribed to me? The list of drugs I was prescribed is incredibly long, and I'm not particularly crazy. But as any of you, and I'm sure there's some of you in the room who have the similar experiences, any of you know when you are diagnosed with depression, when you're diagnosed with a mood disorder, you are prescribed dozens of different drugs in sequence because it's very hard to find the drug that works. Some people try Prozac, it works great for them, they never have to take anything else, but most people embark on this long experiment of trying to find a drug that works. In my case, none of those drugs did much for me until I was eventually diagnosed. My diagnosis was changed from bipolar disorder to premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So what is that? That basically is like PMS, but on steroids. For 1 week a month, I was completely out of my mind. And my treatment was remarkable. I was given a week of SSRIs, in my case Celexa, in the week right before my period, and I completely stabilized. I got my work done, I was an adequate mother, which is really, given that I have 4 children, it's kind of the best you can hope for. I was a loving wife, I was productive, I was content, everything was very smooth for a while. But my particular treatment required being able to predict with pinpoint accuracy when I was going to get my period, because I had to know what week to take the drugs, right? And what happens if you're a woman when you go into your 40s? Everything kind of goes out of whack. You enter a period called perimenopause, which I didn't even know what that was. Turns out it's worse before you're menopausal than when you're actually menopausal. And sometimes I would get my period twice in a month. Sometimes I wouldn't get it for 3 months. But the whole premise of my treatment was that I could predict my period so that I could time my drugs. And I stopped being able to do that. And my mood plummeted, and I got more and more depressed, and I got more and more angry, and more irritable, and I stopped being productive at work. I became a terribly angry partner. I became a horribly angry mother, and things just began to spiral out of control until one day I was standing in front of my medicine cabinet, evaluating its contents, seeing what would kill me most effectively. It turns out that the thing that I need to not have in my medicine cabinet is acetaminophen, because that is the drug that was most available to overdose on, far more dangerous than anything else I had in my medicine cabinet. And at that moment, I knew that I had to do something. The drugs that were available to me via prescription were not working, the therapies and treatments weren't working, and around that time, a book showed up in my house. When you're a writer, books kind of flow through your house. People send them for blurbs. People want you to review them. They kind of come in. When you're an academic, and I had been teaching for 7 years, some period before a class at the University of California Law School called The Legal and Social Implications of the War on Drugs, people tend to send you books in your subject matter. And this book had shown up in my house, and it was called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. I am not a psychedelic explorer. I have, the inside of my head is a terrifying place. I don't really want to spend any time examining it. I wasn't interested in Timothy Leary. I wasn't interested in psychedelics. When I met my husband, I remember saying to him with great authority that I understood that if you did LSD 8 times, you would go insane forever. And he looked at me and sort of blinked and said, "Do I seem insane?" I'd never done psychedelic drugs in my life. So I'd put the book aside when it showed up, but then in the midst of this terrible depression, I just picked it up for no reason that I can really understand. I started leafing through it, and I found this chapter on microdosing. Microdosing. So what is microdosing? Microdosing is taking a sub-therapeutic dose of a drug, a dose so low that it is unlikely to produce any kind of whole body effect or any kind of effect that you can perceive, so it's sub-perceptual, but it's a high enough dose that it allows for some kind of cellular response, right? No tripping, but a cellular response. So I read about microdosing in this book by James Fadiman, who had been in the 1960s an LSD researcher, doing really interesting work in what is now Silicon Valley outside of Stanford. He was exploring specifically the connection between LSD and creativity. He was giving he and his partners were giving high doses of LSD to engineers, scientists, architects, to see if the LSD would help them to solve intractable problems in their work. Every scientist would come with a problem they'd been working on for months, and under the influence of LSD, they would see if they could solve that problem. Spoiler alert, yes, they could solve the problem, kind of miraculous. All sorts of patents and things resulted from that research. The researchers were also tripping themselves at the time, which was a frequent, kind of made their research hard to, somewhat less reliable than it might have been otherwise if they actually hadn't been tripping, but such were the times. So James Fadiman had written this book about microdosing, and then I did what we all do when we see something that's interesting. I went on the internet and I found an interview with Jim in which he talked about having spoken to someone who was microdosing, who described her experience as not having, she had no hallucinations, she didn't, there were no kaleidoscopic colors, but at the end of the day, she looked back on her day and she thought, oh, well, that was a really good day. And I hit pause on my computer and I just stared at it because I had not had a really good day in as long as I could remember. I had been so depressed for so long that the idea of a really good day was mind-boggling, and I had to give it a try. So the bottle arrives in the mail. I take the LSD. I have a friend with me because, like I said, I've never done acid, and I'm terrified. I imagine all sorts of awful things are going to happen, even though, I've done my research, and I know that I'm not supposed to trip, but what if what if it's a real dose, and what's going to, maybe I'll lose my mind. And nothing happens. Nothing happens. My friend and I look at each other, I kind of shrug. I get out my laptop, I get to work, start my daily writing, and at some point I look out the window and into my garden, and my dogwood tree was in bloom. And it wasn't like, butterflies were flying all over. I looked at the tree and I thought, oh, look, the dogwood's in bloom. How pretty. And at that moment I realized everything had changed, because I had been all but anhedonic until that moment. I had been unable to appreciate beauty. I had been unable to see anything positive in my life. And with that single microdose, the back of my depression was broken. I went on for the next month to take the dose on a 3-day cycle. So I would take a microdose one morning, experience its effects. The second day I would not take a dose, but I would continue to experience the effects. And on the third day I had kind of a reset day. On the third day I would wake up and I would say to myself, oh, well, there you are again. And then with eagerness I would take it on day 4. It was remarkable how much better I felt. This is not to say that I was happy all the time. This is not to say that every day was a really good day, but my depression had lifted. I felt productive. I felt like I could be a better version of myself than I had been for as long as I could remember. I felt normal. And then I started wondering why. What is going on? Why is this tiny dose of a drug that makes some people, see different color, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Why is that making me less depressed? And the fact is that it actually makes sense. So I'm going to take you back a little bit to 1938 in Basel, Switzerland, and Albert Hofmann, who is the person who discovered LSD. So Albert Hofmann, a research scientist, is studying the ergotamine molecule. It's a fungus that would infect rye harvests periodically, mostly during the Middle Ages. And when communities would experience this, when their rye would become overwhelmed with this ergotamine this ergot fungus, they would experience sort of two different kinds of effects. One, the whole entire community would go completely insane, or they would have these kind of gangrenous results and their limbs would start dropping off. Not great. Not great. But, pharmacists are interested in things that cause different reactions, and ergotamine seemed like a very powerful molecule. So Sandoz, for whom Albert Hofmann was working, said, go on, see what you can do with this molecule, see if you can change it in ways that might be useful, say for relieving inflammation, for helping with high blood pressure. So Albert Hofmann starts making variations on this molecule. Variation number 1, variation number 2. He gets up to variation number 25, LSD 25, and it doesn't really seem to do much. His lab animals are kind of acting weird, but it's not having the results that he is looking for. So he puts it aside, he goes on to LSD 26, 27, and on, and then for no reason that he can really understand, one day he goes back to LSD 25, and he looks at it again. And either he lifted his finger to his mouth or he absorbed something through his fingertips, but Albert Hofmann took the first LSD trip when he was looking at his synthesized molecule. And from then on, he actually ended up probably with a fairly large dose, blew his own mind, and then went on to study, purposely to ingest LSD, and Sandoz began marketing LSD. So initially it was marketed as a way for medical professionals to understand the subjective experience of their mentally ill clients. It was marketed, would you like to know what it's like to be psychotic? Well, it was marketed as, very quickly people began to find all sorts of uses for it, like it could alleviate addiction, specifically alcohol addiction. LSD therapy became all the rage from between the sort of 50s, 60s. Cary Grant, the actor, gave an interview in 1959 about the benefit of his 60 therapeutic LSD sessions. Think about that the next time you go to the movies. He credited LSD with helping him overcome his narcissism, his dishonesty. He also felt that it made him extraordinarily attractive to young women. That comment I actually think is very poignant when you consider the fact that there are rumors about his sexual orientation. The research during that time on LSD was really interesting and compelling, and it helps to explain the experience I was having with microdosing. The alcoholism research is something that I find particularly interesting, and the history of that I think is something that we don't know. So for Bill W., some of you may be fellow travelers, was the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Most people don't know that Bill W. credits a psychedelic experience with being what inspired his sobriety. He had a medically supervised belladonna trip, and after that he became sober. When he was exposed to LSD, when he took LSD, he believed that LSD was going to be the secret to Alcoholics Anonymous' success, and he went back to the board of Alcoholics Anonymous and he said, well, I found the answer. In addition to our 12-step model, here's step number 13. He was outvoted, and LSD did not become part of the therapeutic rubric of Alcoholics Anonymous. But there is something to that. Albert Hofmann himself began in the later part of his life. Although he continued to use LSD in large doses, he also began experimenting with LSD in microdoses, 10 and 20 microgram doses. He used it when walking amidst tall trees as a kind of tonic to improve his mood, to allow him to experience bouts of creativity and focus. So, why does this work? What's going on in the brain? That was the question that I really tried to answer during the course of this experiment and since. So we know from fMRI studies of the brain that psychedelics, specifically psilocybin, but LSD and psilocybin, which is the ingredient in magic mushrooms, they seem to work in pretty much identical ways. Psilocybin reduces blood flow specifically to the default mode network in the brain. So what is the default mode network? The default mode network is a network of brain activity that links part of your cerebral cortex to these deep, deep brain structures that are involved in memory and emotion. It's most active when nothing else demands your attention. It's where you ruminate, where you daydream, where you plan. It's like your stream of consciousness. It's also that voice in your head that is so critical. That voice that when you're not doing anything that tells you that you're worthless, that you're useless, that you're a fraud. It's been described, the default mode network, as the brain's orchestra conductor or its CEO. It's critical to the construction of ego. And psychedelics seem, in large doses, to temporarily take it offline, to inspire something we call ego dissolution. People always say when they have these psychedelic trips something like, I existed only as an idea or concept. I didn't know where I ended and my environment began. They describe becoming part of a larger universe. That is really the hallmark of the mystical experience which we associate with large LSD doses. So why? What does this do? Well, these psychedelic drugs, LSD, psilocybin, some others, what they do is they act as agonists on, and I'm getting a little technical here, I'll explain it in a second, 5-HT2A and 5-HT2C receptors in the brain. An agonist is a chemical that binds to a receptor and activates that receptor to produce a biological response. SSRIs, antidepressants, those are 5-HT2B receptor agonists. So LSD and psychedelics are working on 2A and 2C. SSRIs are working on 2B, but they seem to be having a similar effect. These receptors are implicated in mood, so it makes sense that psychedelics, that LSD, would work on mood. And in fact, there is currently research going on in the United States, in Canada, in London, showing that psychedelics in more typically hallucinogenic doses, not microdoses, but in large doses, are actually successful in alleviating depression. There has been a remarkable revival in the course of the past decade using psychedelics specifically to alleviate depression and also to ameliorate addiction. So right now, there's a study at the University of New Mexico that finds that psychotherapy and psilocybin in tandem, when used together, cause individuals with alcoholism to be sober for longer. Remarkable, right? The depression studies are even more striking. Individuals facing the end of their lives are going through mediated psilocybin trips with trained therapists and finding the depression they're feeling and anxiety they're feeling at the prospect of death lifted. And now we're expanding the American FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, has allowed for further testing, not just on people who are facing the end of their lives, but people like me, people who just feel shitty. And we're finding that there are results that are even more dramatic than the results that have been shown with traditional SSRIs. So I think, is it?
You've got...
I'll just say a few more words about this. So I experienced this remarkable month where my mood dramatically changed. My relationships changed. I didn't tell my children, hey, kids, mommy's going to be tripping on acid for the next month, so you know. But I did say, hey, guys, I'm trying a new medication. Keep your eyes out. Tell me what you notice. And my kids they noticed a profound result. And I've done this before during the course of my depression. I've said, like, you know, I'm trying Zoloft. Do I seem different? I'm trying Topamax. Do I seem different? And the only time they've ever really noticed a profound difference was during this month-long experiment. My eldest son described it best. He said, you know, when I walk through the door, you're just there. You make a joke. You sit down with me. You're present for me in a way you haven't been able to be in a really long time. And I think that really is the key to what I experienced doing this microdosing experiment. I felt present. It wasn't like all my moods were perfect, but when I was having a bad day, when I was experiencing a bad mood, I noticed it as a bad mood. I looked at it and I said to myself, oh, you're having a bad mood. Your chest feels a little tense. You have a headache. You feel a little stressed out, that kind of anxious knot in your stomach. Maybe you should take a deep breath. Maybe you should lie down. Maybe you should have a glass of water. The difference is when I was depressed, or when I've been depressed, and I would feel that knot of anxiety, my brain would say, your life is terrible. Things are bad. You feel anxious because things are, and I would search for the reason for my anxiety. Oh, I know what it is. It's because your last book didn't do as well as the one before. It's because your husband is sick of your moods. It's because your children are I would search for a reason for, my default mode network would sit there ruminating on the reason for my depression, and it would come up with a solution, because it always does, right? But when I was microdosing, I was better able to understand those sensations, those moods, as transient sensations and moods. I was, for lack of a better word, mindful, which for me was the secret to contentment. And with that, I think I'll sit down and we can talk.
Ayelet. Wonderful. And we'd love to involve you in the conversation too, so feel free to make your way to a microphone. We've got 1, 2, and 1 in the middle there as well. We'd love to hear your questions. So, I did actually love, though, the fact that I think it was your daughter at one point in this month.
Oh, yeah.
Not knowing that it was LSD that you were taking.
She was so, it was one morning.
You were being very nice.
And I was being so nice, and I'm not a normal person. I'm not normally very nice in the morning. I just sit with a cup of tea, looking grim. Sometimes I read the paper, which makes it even worse. And my children are used to me kind of, snarling at them until I kind of wake up, and then I'm a decent person. Half of them are like me. The other half are like their father, disgustingly pleasant in the morning. And my disgustingly pleasant in the morning child, I was making breakfast for her, and I was fiddling with her hair, and I was being this sort of nauseatingly cheerful version of mom. And she looked at me and she said, "What is wrong with you? Are you on acid?"
Did someone put LSD in
Why
your tea?
do you ask? Funny you should say that. Yeah, that was
you didn't
amazing.
tell your kids.
No, well, I didn't. They were younger, and I was ashamed. I was embarrassed, and I was afraid, they might tell someone, and that it's because it's in the United States, using drugs, just simply using drugs can be cause to take away your children. So I had reason to be afraid, but I was afraid.
Why were you ashamed? Sorry, why would you use the word shame?
Well, I was ashamed of, it's interesting. Being mentally ill, when I do these events about this book, invariably, there are a dozen people who ask questions and are very public and open about, they start the question with, the 25th time I did LSD, or when I was at Burning Man, or, I was in a K-hole that was really rocking my world. No shame, no sense, it's illegal, right? But they don't feel, justifiably, they don't feel any shame. And at the events, there's always a handful of people who, with great shame and in great secrecy, pull me aside and confess to being depressed, to being suicidal. It is far more embarrassing in contemporary society to, the great unspoken, talk about a dangerous idea, to confess that you yourself have a mental illness, to confess that you feel bad, that you're not, cheerfully doing your yoga practice and typically looking on, your family with joy every day. It's a far more dangerous thing and a far more humiliating thing to acknowledge. So I was ashamed of being mentally ill, and I was ashamed of doing something illegal, and scared, and all sorts of things.
And yet, what's interesting about the fact that it was LSD is that you also describe yourself as a cynic, a great cynic of all things countercultural.
And religion especially. I was raised by atheist parents. I'm very, I turn up my nose at, I'm the person, I actually like going to yoga, but I'm the person who sits there being like, oh, I don't want to no, stop with the gong. Let's just, sweat a little. I have very little, I'm very narrow-minded when it comes to spirituality, and that's like, the work that I have to do to overcome that indoctrination. I would say my parents are as dogmatic about their atheism as the most fanatic, say, member of the Westboro Baptist Church. It's just a different kind of dogma. So but I know, I think part of me was also sort of embarrassed to be participating in this kind of psychedelic thing. I find the descriptions of people's acid trips are, I think, the most boring thing in the world. And like a movie where they're trying to portray an acid trip is also the most boring thing in the world. So it was very confusing to me that I was embarking on this journey. But in fact, over the course of this month, those biases were cracked open a little bit. And I began to think...
Because of how you were feeling?
Yes, because I was finding myself more open-minded in general. So at first, when I was talking, I did a lot of interviews, I wrote this book during that microdosing month, and I did a tremendous amount of interviews, and I talked to a lot of people. And when I was interviewing people who had experienced spiritual awakenings taking LSD, or when I was interviewing the researchers doing the studies at Johns Hopkins, at UCLA, at NYU, I kept saying, well, but is it real? Like, yeah, they're having a spiritual awakening. Is it real, or is it just their brain is telling them it's a spiritual awakening? And the researchers very patiently would say, well, what difference does it make? And I would find that so frustrating. And then at some point, I started interrogating myself and saying, well, what difference does it make? And why are you so afraid of spirituality? And why are you so afraid of insight and meaning and the notion of a connection within the universe? And it's not like I'm out there now banging a gong, let's be clear. I'm much too much of a cynic for that.
A little bit banging the gong. How microdosing made a mega difference in my mood, my marriage, and my life.
Yeah,
That's a bit gong banging. That's a little bit gong banging.
Small
gong. It could have all been placebo.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the thing.
Placebo is a profound drug.
Placebo is, it is incredible. The research on the placebo effect is incredibly compelling. It is entirely possible that what I experienced during this experiment, microdosing, was the mother of all placebo effects. I don't believe so, subjectively. I believe that I experienced a neurochemical response, but who knows? That's why what this book really calls for is research. What I want, and what we're beginning to see now more and more, is real research on psychedelics, specifically on microdoses. Why is, it doesn't really make sense that we only have been researching these large doses. Let's see what a microdose does. So we're starting to see some research. We need double-blind, placebo-controlled research so that we can really understand, does this have an effect? What is the effective dose? What's happening in people's brains? Is it just a placebo? Is it a myth? Is it really something? We take a lot of drugs that haven't been proven to be particularly effective. Sometimes I say that if you described to me that antidepressants were drugs that were designed to make you really fat and make you not have any interest in sex, but that they had this weird side effect of occasionally making some people feel a little less depressed, that would be a better description of my subjective experience with SSRIs, and many people's.
Yeah.
But, the more research, the better, and that's really what this book is a call for research, and thankfully, the call has been answered in the past year or two, and it's really exciting.
The mainstream is starting to climb on board.
Yeah, there's research being done in Australia on psychedelics. There's research being done on microdoses in particular in the Netherlands, in England. So I am confident that within 5 years, we're going to have much more insight on whether or not microdosing specifically is effective at treating anxiety and depression. I know I have a very strong belief that the answer is yes, but we'll have to see.
Before I come to you for questions, just one more, because some of the most profound sections of this book and this experiment is your analysis of the way in which we treat drug use in our society and the history thereof, and the greatest side effect of drug use can sometimes be being arrested.
Absolutely.
But what I wanted to ask was, you've taken a lot of drugs in your time, okay? You've taken a lot of pharmaceuticals, prescribed by professionals.
Oh, yeah.
Psychotropic medication, big impact on your brain, big impact on your body. You lap them up. I mean, because you were struggling and you were looking for psychotropic solutions, as well as all the other things that you were trying. And yet the cultural narrative around those drugs is totally different to the cultural narrative around, particularly as LSD, such an interesting example, isn't it?
Right. Well, it's really interesting. So for years when I would teach the class on the legal and social implications of the war on drugs, I would start every semester with a whiteboard, and I would have these categories: food, drug, medicine. And I would say, start naming things. Let's see where we're going to put them on the board. So, it would be easy. We would say acetaminophen. Okay, let's put that up on medicine. Heroin. Well, let's put that up on drug. Well, morphine? We're going to put that up on medicine, but we're going to put, those are very, the opioids, where do they fall? Do they fall in medicine or drug? Where does caffeine fall? Is caffeine a food? Yeah. Coffee's a food. Is it a drug? Yeah, I mean, hello, this is Australia. God knows you people know that caffeine is a drug. So, that the idea of making those categories is really arbitrary. And the distinction between legal and illegal drugs is even more arbitrary
and
than that.
And terrifying to an extent. The history around race.
Absolutely. So in the United States in particular, different drugs have been criminalized only because of the way that we've criminalized them is by associating them with different minority groups. So at the turn of the last century, the typical opioid user, addict, was a white Southern woman tippling from her bottle of laudanum all day. You used to be able to get heroin from the Sears Roebuck catalog. Little package of heroin, a little band to tie off, and a syringe. Order it just like you ordered your, work trousers from the Sears Roebuck catalog. And then over the course of a couple of decades, we found different drugs were criminalized in different ways. So marijuana, for example, it was criminalized because it was associated with Mexican immigrants. And the Hearst newspaper would publish these articles, and for all of you pot smokers, this will blow your mind, they saying that marijuana made Mexican men voraciously sexually predatory. That under the influence of weed, they would rape white women. Anybody who spent an afternoon smoking a joint can probably assess the sense of that.
They go to sleep and they have a...
Cocaine, even more nefariously, was associated, the newspapers, even the New York Times, would publish these articles about how when black men would consume cocaine, they became immune to large caliber bullets. That it made them so aggressive that you could fire a dozen .22 bullets into them and they wouldn't stop. So that's why Southern police organizations have these much larger caliber bullets. So that, that each drug was associated with a different group and was thus criminalized. And the psychedelics were, the reason that psychedelics became criminalized is because psychedelics were used by whom? They were used by young people, by hippies, by the counterculture. What was going on at the time? The Vietnam War. What was the counterculture doing besides taking LSD? They were protesting the war. So you had this confluence of factors. There's war protests, there's hippies taking acid, and then the war protesters and the civil rights movement became unified. And that was when the American government began first criminalized LSD and then began aggressively prosecuting its use. So, it's never about the drug. It's always about the political, social, economic situation in which the drug finds itself.
And through some health workers' lens, through the health issues as well. So,
right. I mean, if we had a public health, the model of that I propose in this book and that I've always talked about is we want to have a public health model, right? We want to treat drugs from a public health point of view, not from a criminal justice point of view. If you have someone who is addicted to heroin, it doesn't do you or society any good to prosecute that person and throw them in jail. What you want is to treat it as the disease that it is. And a public health model would cause you to look at psychedelics, understand what's going on in the brain, and say, can we use these remarkably potent drugs to alleviate this tremendous societal problem?
So much to talk about. Let's grab some of your questions. If you could keep them fairly brief and concise so we can get to as many people as possible, that would be fantastic. Mic there, mic there, mic there. Thank you so much for your patience.
Hello. Thank you for that. That was really inspiring, and as a fellow depressed person, there's also a lot to relate to there, especially, and this is kind of what I want to get into, in the either the suppression or the changing of the default mode. So I guess the first part of my question is, do you feel like your default mode was suppressed or changed in some way? Secondly, do you feel that has, tell us a bit about the longevity of that effect, and also, do you feel like you've lost anything by doing that?
So the last part of the question, absolutely not. I don't romanticize depression. I'm a writer. Depression didn't make me more creative. It didn't make me more artistic. It just kept me from being able to do my work. So microdosing does not sustain. The changes that it works on your brain, the effects that it has, do not outlast the drug. In my case, what happened, I was able, while microdosing, to use the tools of my therapy more effectively, and that sustained. So I had been doing cognitive behavioral therapy for a long time, as many depressed people have, and I would just be like, blah, 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 write down your mood, shut up, I don't care. But during the course of the microdosing experiment, I actually looked at the kind of therapy that I was doing. I started this new thing called dialectical behavior, new to me, dialectical behavioral therapy, that was traditionally used for people with borderline personality disorder, but is now being used for other diagnoses. And for the first time in my life, it became really effective. However, it is not, using microdosing for a month does not solve your depression. There is no doubt in my mind, none, that if microdoses were legal, if I could use them, I could trust the source, there was research that I would be microdosing now. No doubt in my mind. But unfortunately, it isn't. That being said, the research seems to show that large dose hallucinogenic, like, knocking back 150 micrograms of LSD with a therapist and a guide, that those effects do seem to sustain for longer.
Okay.
Which is not to say I'm encouraging anybody. I do want to make it through Australia without being arrested. So not telling anybody to go out and have an acid trip, but
Are we all clear on that, people? Thank you.
Well, related, if it was legal, under what circumstances?
If it were legal, in my perfect universe, we would have these wonderful psychedelic centers, like psychedelic spas, where you could go, and it would be very beautiful and out in nature. It would smell really good, and there would be a very kindly, knowledgeable guide who would nurture you through the experience. And you could do it whenever you wanted, once a year, once a week, whatever. Do it with your partner. Do it it would be your engagement present. It would be your therapy. There's some, I know some people who use moderate doses of psychedelics on a quarterly basis, that they feel like that makes sense for their mental health. So that would be your therapy model. So I think that would be ideal. But I'm also someone who believes that the criminalization of any drug is far more destructive than the drug itself. So I would also argue for safe injection sites for heroin users. The research shows that if you provide people with heroin, they actually are more likely to stop using heroin than if you criminalize the conduct. So I think that for larger doses, the spa model.
It's very Californian.
Isn't that wonderful?
It's very Californian.
Who doesn't like a spa? And then I think that I would love to see, the way that you take your Zoloft. I would like to see a model where you could take your microdoses of LSD.
Well, you've got there with medicinal cannabis in California.
Right, they're like Apple stores, the weed shops now. They're super high-tech and really beautiful. They have bud tenders. Those are the bartender, get it? Who are describe the various effects of the cannabis. It's full, those stores are always full. It's so funny to me, they're always full of 65-year-old women very carefully choosing which kind of CBD they want. And yeah, so.
Could you get there with LSD is the question. Have we got a question up there? Thanks.
I think we are there with psilocybin in the Netherlands, so yeah, you could get there.
My question is, you mentioned that within the next 5 years, it looks like the clinical trials may provide us with enough evidence to start putting it to pharmaceuticals. How long until a person could actually go to a health professional to be prescribed microdosing?
So, that's a really interesting question.
And they need to investigate the harms, potential harms,
right, so
and
there,
side
we
effects.
need to, there needs to be real investigation. So, for example, there are 5-HT2 ABC receptors in your heart. So what happens when we trigger those receptors every 3 days? We don't know the answer to that. Well, the same is true about SSRIs. There is some research that seemed to indicate that long-term use of SSRIs might not be the greatest thing for cardiac health. So I would like that question answered. But I don't know the answer to that because I don't know whether there's going to be an America in 6 months. I think that prognosticating at this point about the future when the President of the United States is a Cheeto-hued madman is a fool's errand. So, but I actually think one of the benefits of having a clown as the President of the United States is the United States exported its drug policy to the entire world. And it was through a combination of treaty and also moral authority. So everybody had to criminalize drugs in the same way that the United States did or confront the consequences. And when different countries tried to do different things, like when Britain explored heroin distribution programs that were remarkably effective in keeping people alive, the United States clamped down on them. Well, we no longer have any moral authority. no, maybe the only benefit of this is that nobody cares what the United States says or thinks anymore, and will care and think, less and less as time goes on.
They
and
do
countries,
care, though. I mean, the whole world has its eyes on you.
right? But countries now have become more comfortable exploring alternatives to the U.S. war on drugs model. So, for example, Portugal has decriminalized drugs entirely and has seen remarkable results in decreased death, decreased crime, increased well-being. So, not increased well-being because of the drugs, but rather the society as a whole is benefiting from the fact that we aren't criminalizing drug use. So, I think that the answer may lie in places like the Netherlands, in places like Britain. You guys tend to be a little behind, so sorry, I don't mean to say that in, but it'll probably follow Britain. But I don't really feel comfortable predicting, because like I said, I don't know if there's going to be a constitution of the United States in a year. Sorry.
Thank you.
My husband said, try not to talk about Trump. Everywhere you
It's
go,
hard
you
not
talk
to.
about Trump. Just
Everyone
try not to
suppresses
talk.
it, and then it just leaks out like our subconscious. Hi.
Hi, is this close enough?
Yeah.
Alright, so I have someone in my life who has suffered from bipolar 2, and so I have thought about this as possibly as a means, but I am worried about her safety, about how it's deregulated, and how to really kind of come across with microdosing when it hasn't been really regulated yet. And also my concerns around when you take SSRIs or any kind of prescription drug, how they say how dangerous it is to just suddenly not take it or to...
Right.
Yeah.
So a couple things. So it's a very good question. LSD is activating. Psilocybin is activating. Psychedelics are activating. So what that means is if you are bipolar, if you are in a manic state or a hypomanic state, it is a bad idea to take a drug that activates. It can trigger an enhanced mania or an enhanced hypomania if you're lucky, but an enhanced mania if you are not. So I am very hesitant to... certainly I would never encourage anybody with a mood disorder that cycles between mania and depression to take a drug that makes them more activated. We need, for the same reason that most psychiatrists will not prescribe antidepressants alone to someone with responsible psychiatrists, to someone with bipolar disorder because of the risk of triggering mania. So, it is a dangerous game, and we don't have the research. The thing that I can tell you, and the thing that I feel very comfortable recommending, is that there's great research around ketamine, which in the United States at least is legal. And I'm not talking about tumbling into a K-hole at a party. I'm talking about prescription ketamine. There's great evidence that ketamine alleviates profound, immediate symptoms of depression. So if your partner or someone you love or you are in a crisis state, a physician-moderated ketamine experience can reduce the symptoms of depression. It doesn't last, but it can alleviate an urgent depression that could potentially be fatal. I mean, the thing that is important to know
And it's
about
finding a clinician that...
Yes, absolutely. And there,
can
I don't know about in Australia,
supervise
but
you.
in the United States, and so thus I imagine in Australia too, there are a lot of ketamine practitioners. They tend to be anesthesiologists or psychiatrists. But, it's... I am very hesitant I don't recommend anybody go down this path because these diseases are... They're very serious. I mean, the suicide rates for bipolar disorder can hover in the 25, attempt rates can hover in the 25 percentile. So it would be incredibly irresponsible to encourage someone to engage in an activity that has not been proven. The only thing I'm willing to say is that my suicidal feelings were alleviated by this experience.
Thank you for your question. Thank you. At number 4, at the back.
Yeah, hi, Ayelet, hi again, hello. Given that the reason that most people go to a GP nowadays is because of some type of mental health concern, And given that there's more than 100 studies that have been completed that are really proving the efficacy of psychedelic medicine, given that Australia is way behind in this area, what would you suggest, being from outside Australia, that we could do as a collective group to really speed up the legalisation of these medicines for therapeutic purposes?
Well, I think it all comes down to research, right? I think it's about publicizing the research. You're not going to convince anybody. You're not going to convince a politician. You're not going to convince a scientist by anecdotal experiences like mine. They're not going to, say, "Oh, that Ayelet Waldman seemed to feel better." But what there is now is hard research. And in the United States, what we do is we challenge the scheduling of drugs. So drugs are scheduled according to their severity. Schedule 1 means you cannot even experiment with it. You can't prescribe it, all the way down to Schedule 3. But you can challenge the scheduling of drugs, and you can present evidence in an administrative court of the utility of those drugs, saying that there is in fact a medical use. And so I imagine that there's a similar structure in Australia, and the research is really good. This is no longer, God love him, I love Jim Fadiman, this is no longer Jim taking LSD with his research subjects, or Timothy Leary tripping on acid and,
But they're still not large-scale studies. So
no, but they're into the next phase. So
they're getting better. The design is getting better.
So each you have to you have to go through sort of tiers of studies. So initially it's a smaller group, and then it gets wider. So we are now in the next tier of psilocybin trials in the United States. So the research is very good, and there are researchers here in Australia who are doing it. So I think it's all about the research. And the fact is, we have a worldwide mental health crisis. How many people in this room have had their lives touched by depression and anxiety, either yourself or someone you love? I mean, it's almost everybody. So we have this kind of crisis, and I think that research and presenting that research and maybe making the argument in a sober, rational, non-exaggerated manner is the best way to move forward.
Let's take a final question. Hello, I think you're at number 3 there. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering what advice you would give to someone who's going to be following in your footsteps, say, but would end up developing psychotic symptoms as a result of the LSD that they've ingested.
So if someone who has developed psychotic symptoms as a result of LSD, if you have developed psychotic symptoms as a result of an LSD trip,
how would you differentiate between...
Don't take any more LSD.
Well, that's
Please.
A bit on the nose, isn't it? What I'm asking is, I guess you're talking about spiritual concepts that can come from the result of taking LSD.
It's not worth it.
But then, so what I'm asking is, how are you able to provide this advice to people to navigate a very difficult, potentially life-threatening experience? I guess my question is, you haven't really touched on the risks.
Oh, so you want to talk about risk. So there's the notion of LSD psychosis and the evidence about LSD. There's far more fear of LSD-related psychosis than there is actual evidence of LSD psychosis. So there are some individuals who ended up hospitalized after LSD trips for what was diagnosed as LSD psychosis, except generally what happens is individuals are frightened by their bad trip, and they go to the emergency room. And they are exhibiting the symptoms of psychosis, i.e. an acid trip.
But that's a
and
risk.
They are then...
But that's a risk in and of itself, if someone's not coping with a trip.
Right. So it is, but the experience of the bad trip is constrained by time, and in a supported environment, there's no such thing as an acid trip that lasts forever. People work through that. Sometimes the emotional consequences can be profound, but there is very little good, hard evidence that there is actually a phenomenon of long-term LSD psychosis. And in fact, in most cases where that has been alleged, further exploration has found that the research doesn't sustain. The evidence doesn't hold water. However, nonetheless, it is not a good idea for anyone with psychiatric symptoms like psychosis, as I was saying, like bipolar disorder, like psychotic mania. The LSD can make those symptoms worse. So that's why I discourage anyone who experiences those symptoms from, this is not, this isn't, it's like if you have, if you have high blood pressure, you don't take a drug that raises your blood pressure. So if you have an underlying psychosis, you don't take a drug that could exacerbate those symptoms.
Thank you for your question, though, but we must continue because you've all got to go to the next session. Take it up with the book signing
Yeah,
if you'd want to. Yeah,
feel free to come and talk to me, and you can always also tell me
you.
about your acid trip, though I can't promise to be interested.
As we wrap, though, can I just ask, why did you stop?
It's illegal.
That's it.
Yeah.
Can we thank Ayelet Waldman?